Welcome to Yehoshua's Daf Yomi Shiur, where the Daf continues daily until the complete revelation of Mashiach ben David, Messiah the son of David. We are studying Tractate Chullin, page 113 today, starting with page A, top of the page, side A, that is Amud Aleph, top of the page, with the words V'lema le midishmuel. ולמה לשמואל, דאמר שמואל מליח הרי קוקרותיח וחבוש וכמבושל. The Gemara objects, but let Rava say to him the same ruling by instead citing the seemingly more relevant statement of Shmuel, as Shmuel said, a salted food imparts its flavor like a boiling food, and a marinated food is as absorbent as a cooked food. Clearly, the kosher meat absorbed flavor from the meat of the treifa as it would have had they been cooked together. The Gemara explains, had Rava based his ruling only on Shmuel's statement, I would say in response, this statement applies only to the absorption of the blood of the meat. But kosher meat is not prohibited if it absorbs only the juices and the gravy of the meat of the treifa. Since, in this case, the meat is salted in a perforated vessel, the blood from each piece runs out and is not absorbed by the other, and one might think that the kosher meat remains permitted. Rava's interpretation of the verse in Leviticus teaches us that the juices and gravy of the meat of the treifa must also be taken into account. Meisvei daktor shemalchoi im dakdome mutor. Maila shoshne meluchin lo kikoin shotor maliach v'tomei tofel. The Gemara raises an objection from a Braita. A kosher fish that when salted together with a non-kosher fish is permitted. What? Is it not referring to a case where they were both salted and expelled juices? Where they were both salted and expelled juices? This indicates that the kosher fish is not prohibited by the juices of the non-kosher fish, contrary to Rava's statement. The Gemara responds, no, this is referring to a case where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted. Since an unsalted fish does not emit juices, the kosher fish does not absorb the flavor of the non-kosher fish. מכלל נראה בששניהם מלוכין עוסקינון פירוש כמפורש תואר שמלוכים דוק תומי מותר כיצד שהיה תואר מליח ותומי תופל. The Gemara challenges, but from the fact that the latter clause teaches, but if the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted, the kosher fish remains permitted. It may be inferred that in the first clause we are dealing with a case where they are both salted. The Gemara responds, the latter clause is explaining the halacha of the first clause. The Braita should be read as follows. A kosher fish that once salted together with a non-kosher fish is permitted. How so? This is the halacha if the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted. Hachinami mistavra disal kedai dechere sheshnein meluchim hashta shneim meluchim shori toer moliach v'tomei tofel miboye. The Gemara notes, so too it is reasonable that this is the meaning of the Braita, as if it enters your mind that the first clause is referring to a case where both of them are salted, one can claim. Now that the Braita has stated that even if both of them are salted, the kosher fish is permitted, it is necessary to state that the same applies in the last problematic case where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted. Im mishum ha lo iriat nasefer legalo reisha delo temeresh zoymuniach v'tamei tofel aval shnei meluchin asur tanasefer tomaliach v'tamei tofel miklan deresh shnei meluchin v'pinachim sharim. The Gemara rejects this. If it is due to that reason, there is no conclusive argument. It is possible that the first clause of the Braita is indeed referring to a case where both fish are salted, and the Tana of the Braita nevertheless taught the latter clause to shed light on the first clause, so that you should not say the first clause is referring only to a case where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted, but if they were both salted, then the kosher fish is prohibited. To rule this out, he taught the latter clause, which explicitly makes reference to a case where the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish unsalted, which, by inference, indicates that the first clause is referring to a case where they are both salted and teaches that even so, the kosher fish is permitted. Toshima mi seifo de seifo, avalim haya tome moliach b'tor, tofel asur. Tome moliach b'tor, tofel hu ad asur, ashnei meluchin shari. The Gemara further suggests coming here proof against Rava's ruling from the latter clause of the latter clause, meaning the third clause of that Braita. But if the non-kosher fish was salted and the kosher fish was unsalted, the kosher fish is prohibited. One can infer from here that it is only if the non-kosher fish is salted and the kosher fish is unsalted and the kosher fish is prohibited. But if they were both salted, then the kosher fish is permitted, contrary to Rava's ruling. I did it on the Reishe. The Gemara rejects this. Perhaps the last section of the Braita uses this language only since it teaches in the former clause, meaning the second clause. If the kosher fish was salted and the non-kosher fish was unsalted, etc., the Braita therefore taught the last clause as well, using parallel language. If the non-kosher fish was salted and the kosher fish unsalted, etc., but nothing can be derived from here with regard to a case where both fish were salted. Siman bisra di anach nafkuda. The Gemara provides the mnemonic for remembering the three halachot stated by Shmuel below. The manner in which blood is expelled from meat. Salted meat that is placed on a vessel, an animal whose neck is broken before its soul departs. Amar Shmuel, ein habasar yoitzi midei damoi, ela im keimolcho yofe yofe, medicha yofe yofe. Itmar, Rav Huna Amar, Molech modiach v'masnisatano modiach molach modiach v'lo pligi ha'dichalei beit habacha ha'dilo chalele beit habacha ravdimi men harda malach le b'milcha galal nisa u'minapes le. Shmuel says meat cannot be rid of its blood unless one salts it thoroughly and rinses it thoroughly in water. It was stated, Rav Huna says one must salt and rinse the meat in water. And it was taught in the Braita one must rinse the meat and salt it, and then rinse it again. The Gemara adds, and these two rulings do not disagree. The ruling of Rav Huna is referring to a case where one already washed the meat in the slaughterhouse before salting, whereas that Braita is referring to a case where one did not wash the meat in the slaughterhouse. The Gemara relates, Rav Dimi of Nerda would salt meat with coarse salt, and then shake the salt off the meat. Amar Rav Misharshia, ein mechazikin dam bivnei me'ayim, targima akarsha, u'me'aya v'hadra dichanta. Rav Misharshia says one does not presume that there is blood in the intestines, and therefore they are not prohibited if they have not been salted. The Gemara comments the sages interpreted this statement as referring to the rectum, the intestines, and the spiral colon. Amar Shmuel Evenichin Basar Maliach Ela Al Yedei Klim Menukav. Shmuel says one may place salted meat only on a perforated vessel so that the expelled blood can run out. But if the vessel is not perforated, then the blood will pool and be reabsorbed by the meat. Rav Sheshes Malach Le Garma Garma. Trei Mai Taimala Mishum Ni Parish Mihayu Vlahai Chadnami Parish Mihai Gisa Bahai Gisa Edaloishna. The Gemara relates Rav Sheshet would salt meat one bone. Rav Sheshet would salt meat one bone, meaning one piece at a time. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that he would not salt two together? Could it be because the blood leaves this piece and that piece absorbs it? If so, with regard to one piece as well, one could claim that the blood leaves this side of the piece and that side absorbs it. Rather, there is no difference between one piece and two pieces, and one may even salt several pieces together. Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Chio Hashoiver mipar ketam shel behema koidim shetetze nafsho harei ze machbid es habaso vegoize les habriois umavlia dam bevorim. Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Chia, one who breaks the neck of an animal after it is slaughtered, but before its soul departs, thereby makes the meat heavy. The meat expels blood at the time of slaughter, but if one breaks the animal's neck, excess blood is trapped inside and weighs down the meat. And by this action he robs people as he causes blood to be absorbed in the animal's limbs. And since he sells the meat by weight, people will pay extra to acquire the same amount of edible meat. But doesn't he have to rid the blood, though? He has to rid the blood. So what's the deal? Alright. Ibaylu hachikamau machmid esabasau v'goyle lesabriyo v'goyze lesabriyo es mishun yadam yavarim adidei shavir dami oidilma adidei nam yasir teiku. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to what cases he's speaking. Does Shmuel mean that there is only one problem with this practice, namely that it renders the meat heavy and robs people since he causes blood to be absorbed in the animal's limbs? If so, it may be inferred that if one wishes to keep the meat for himself, one may well do so, since he is robbing no one. Or perhaps Shmuel is referring to two prohibitions. First, the blood is trapped in the meat renders it prohibited for consumption, and second, that of robbery. If so, then even if one wants to keep the meat for himself, it is also prohibited. The Gemara concludes, Teiku. The Gemara concludes, Teiku. The Gemara concludes, Teiku. Down. This means that it's an unanswered question, an unresolved, unanswered question. We must wait until the Messiah comes to get the answer. And just checking here, this is the 276th Teiku. And for those of you who are following my Teiku program, and you knew that I was doing every Teiku based on the book by Rabbi Aharon Yehoshua Pessin. And this Teiku that we're coming across now was done on Sunday, March 22nd. Of this year. And now we're at the end of August almost. Wow. So this was the 276 Teku. Chullin 113a. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, there you have it. That's a Teku, and now we start a new Mishnah. Let's start the Mishnah right now, right away. Hamale oiv es oiv im hagvina shulchan eno oiver v'lo yisase. One who places the meat of birds with cheese on the table upon which he eats does not thereby violate a Torah prohibition. That's it. That's the whole Mishnah. Now the Talmud. It says the Talmud, ha'oich loi, oiver v'lo yisase shma mina, b'sa oiv b'chalav deraiso, ema malab es oiv im hagvina ala shulchan eno bal yidei lo taseh. The Gemara suggests, since the Mishnah mentions only that placing meat of birds and milk on one table does not violate a Torah prohibition, one may consequently infer that if one eats them together, he does violate a Torah prohibition. If so, learn from the Mishnah that meat of birds in milk is prohibited by Torah law, contrary to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who maintains that it applies by rabbinic law. The Gemara responds, say that the Mishnah should be understood as follows. One who places bird meat with cheese on the table will not thereby come to violate a Torah prohibition, since eating the two together is a rabbinic prohibition, as Rabbi Akiva maintains. Okay, now the new Mishnah. Zog the Mishnah, Besal behema toyer b'chalev behema toyer. Also the Basar behema toyer b'chalev behema tamea, Basar behema tamea b'chalev behema toyer. Muter levashel muter levano. Rabbi Akiva oimer chaya ve'oif einem min toyer shenema lo yisvashel gedi b'chalev imoy. Shalosh pe'amim prat lechaya le'oif u'lebehema tameo. The Mishnah says it is prohibited to cook the meat of a kosher animal and the milk of any kosher animal, not merely the milk of its mother, and deriving benefit from that mixture is prohibited. It is permitted to cook the meat of a kosher animal in the milk of a non-kosher animal. It is permitted to cook the meat of a kosher animal in the milk of a non-kosher animal, or the meat of a non-kosher animal in the milk of a kosher animal, and deriving benefit from that mixture. Not eating it, but you can derive benefit. Rabbi Akiva says cooking the meat of an undomesticated animal or bird in milk is not prohibited by Torah law. As it stated, you should not cook a kid in his mother's milk. Exodus 23:19, 34:26, and Deuteronomy 14:21. 3 times. Okay. The repetition of the word kid 3 times excludes an undomesticated animal, a bird, and a non-kosher animal. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Ne'emar lo yisachlu kol nevela, v'ne'emar lo yisavasher gedi b'chalev imo. Es she'asu mishum nevela asu levasher b'chalav, oif she'asu mishum nevela yasu levasher b'chalav. Tam lo yimar b'chalev imo. Yatsa oif she'en lo chalevim. Okay, Rabbi Yoshua says that it is stated, you shall not eat any animal carcass, Deuteronomy 14:21. And in the same verse it is stated, you shall not cook a kid in his mother's milk. This indicates that meat of an animal that is subject to be prohibited due to the prohibition of eating an unslaughtered carcass is prohibited for one to cook in milk. Consequently, with regard to meat of birds, which is subject to be prohibited due to the prohibition of eating an unslaughtered carcass, one might have thought that it would be prohibited to cook in a milk. Therefore, the verse states, in its mother's milk, excluding a bird which has no mother's milk. Okay, and now for the Gemara. The Talmud says, we'll start the first line and we'll continue it next video. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Rabbi Elazar said, the verse states, and Judah sent the kid of the goats in Genesis 38:20.